missing, people who are missing, have been greatly in the news and maybe on our consciousness as in recent weeks, and we've read of landslides in Aso. The last count I saw, 30 dead, 12 still missing. The Malaysia Airlines Flight 370, 239 disappeared and still missing. The tragedy is people go from the sense of rescue to recovery, from the sense of people being missing to being lost, the sense of missing what is lost. The tension mounts and the missing being lost and the lost gone. Or maybe not. Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel was in the news announcing a reorganization of the process for searching for and identifying tens of thousands of soldiers who have been missing beginning of World War II, and affirming a commitment that everyone will be found. It's an amazing commitment on a day when this is the 20th anniversary today of the beginning of the Rwanda genocide, the machete slayings of 800,000 people. It's a reminder of days like those in El Salvador, in the dirty war in Argentina, in the mass graves found in Iraq and Bosnia-Herzegovina and other places. It's an amazing commitment, the idea that the ones who are lost will be found and identified and brought home. An incredible statement. And yet it's not so far. It's a new commitment in many ways, this sense of the loss. I was reading in the Civil War at Gettysburg that the process of what was done with the war dead, people who had died, was that they were not clearly identified and buried in individual graves in the sense we have when we look across the river at Arlington or go there on a tour. But rather trenches were dug and people were thrown in. Bayonets were converted into hooks to drag the bloated corpses, and they were put on blankets so they could be laid down in the trenches and covered, and then dirt would be thrown on them. Not much of an advancement since the earliest of ancient days when wars were fought by Caesar and others before him. The notion of war in hand-to-hand combat with swords and spears, where people fought so closely to each other that when one fell, people began to step up on top of them because there was no clear ground for fighting anymore. And then when battles were over and tens of thousands of corpses would lay on the field, the dead were there, they would sometimes be buried. But it was such an overwhelming task that even though the desire was there that they not be lost, that their identities not be forgotten, but so often they were simply left on the field. It was a note of valor for armies returning years later to take the bones and bury them because there was some consolation, some morale-building effect for soldiers who were going into the field to know that someday they too would be buried, even if their identities were lost. It's in that sense that one can read this Old Testament lesson from Ezekiel. Ezekiel describing the valley that is probably the Kidron Valley as you go out from Jerusalem after the conquest of Jerusalem, after Nebuchadnezzar destroyed the city, after the choice was made that who would be taken as a slave to Babylon and who would be killed, and only those who had the foresight to somehow escape or flee in advance avoided those choices, after they were left on the field to die and there to be. It's when you read that and understand that when it talks about Ezekiel in the valley, a valley of dry bones, one begins to imagine the scope and scale of it all. And also, one begins to imagine the lament that one can hear as God listening to the people. Not the dry bones, but Ezekiel, he looks out and sees these dry bones and says to the prophet, go breathe life into them. Go breathe into them that they might live. They're not dead. Breathe my spirit and see the flesh restored and the sinews repaired. And it all comes to be, as the prophet proclaims, but there is still the lament that comes from the people, those who've been cut off from their beloved people, their brothers, their sisters, their neighbors, those who've been cut off from their homeland. God hears them. God hears them saying that they are, well, that they lament, that they are the ones. Our bones are dried up, our hope is lost, and we are cut off completely, say the survivors of that onslaught. Our bones are dried up, and our hope is lost completely. We are cut off. We are cut off completely. And the words that you sang in the psalm, out of the depths, imagine the depths. Out of the depths I cry to you, O Lord. Lord, hear my voice. Let your ears be attentive to the voice of my supplications. Crawling out of the depths of the valley of dry bones, or out of the exile where one is broken, one is bereft, one feels abandoned in this far-off place. One can understand Mary and Martha as Jesus comes to town. Their brother has died. Some would say unnecessarily, his brother has died. Lord, if you had been here, my brother would have not died, said Martha. Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died, said Mary. The lament that goes out, the lament of the bereft, those who are left behind, those who are broken. And yet Jesus is able to call out to Lazarus, and he says, Lazarus, come out. Just as Elijah reports, as that story reports how Elijah going to the bones could rise. The problem was not with the dead, the problem was with the living. It was with the people who were to be left behind, the grieving sister, the exiled people who could only lament and bewail the separation that they were experiencing, their own brokenness, their own frustration, their own frailty, their own sickness. And it's to these that God comes and says to Mary and Martha, he bears a testimony so that you might see the glory of God, so that the people here may see God's glory. Lazarus, come out. And he gets up and he comes out, and Jesus says, unbind him and let him go. And a couple chapters later, they're having dinner together in another episode. Or it could be that these words that come through Ezekiel, that the words of God that it's speaking to these people, these are the people that have cried out that our bones are dried up, our hope is lost, we are cut off completely, and God says to them, says to Ezekiel, tell them, I will bring you back. I'm going to bring you back to your home, to your homeland, to one another. I'm going to restore you, renew you. I'm going to bring you back. I will put my spirit within you, and you will live. I am going to breathe life into you, breathing the spirit, the ruah. I'm going to put it in you so that you might live regardless of what you've seen and known and experienced. This is my promise to you. And Paul, writing to the Romans, says, but you are not in the flesh, you are in the Spirit, since the Spirit of God dwells in you. And this is the gospel. You are in God's breath, and God's breath is in you. And the breath of him who raised Jesus from the dead, that dwells in you. He who raised Christ from dead will give life to your mortal bodies also through his Spirit that dwells in you, through his breath that inflates you, that puffs you up, that enables you to live again and again and again, no matter how often you fall down, however broken you may feel, however estranged from the beloved, however distant from home. The Spirit of God comes as promised to you and fills you so that you might live. Now, this is a radical belief, folks. I mean, it begins with the assumption, can these dead bones, can this dead man, can the Jesus who will die actually ever live again? That's radical belief number one. And number two, Can I, when I'm so broken, when I'm so hurt, when I'm so desolate, can I ever feel whole again? Can I ever know wholeness that enables me to live the life, el buen vivir, they say in Spanish, the goodness of life, that I can live that way? And the gospel is proclaimed to us because it's so hard to believe. The dead will live. The death is not the end. The life goes on and on and on, and that can transform you. In that, you can know what it is to be whole. In that, you can rediscover, no matter how bad your week has been, your day has been, your year has been, you can rediscover what it is to live, and live in the glory of God that spreads over you and inflates you and breathes into you. The Holy Spirit is yours. And that, my friends, is the gospel of the Lord. Thanks be to God.